Vongai Nyanvuzi, Dr. Ejike Bob Udegu. Sorry, Vongai Nyanvuzi, the teacher for All Africa, Director, Dr. Ejike Bob Udegu, Center for Study of States, University of London, Ichimunya Hamukoma? What? Hamukoma? Hamukoma? Okay, so just Hamukoma. A researcher for the Brent Hearst Foundation. I did really good on the first name now. Angela Murli, the Africa Program Forward UK, and Dipiti Pardesh, Chief of Mission of International Organization for Migration UK. Please take your seats on stage. All right, thank you so much. I believe, Vongai, why don't you speak first? Yes. This microphone, sure.
Thank you for the introduction. My name is Vongai Nyahunji. I am originally from Zimbabwe, and I work for an organization called Teach for All, and I'm the head of the Africa region. So what, as an organization at Teach for All, our mission is to ensure that every child has access to quality education. But before I go into detail around what I wanted to share today, I was really fascinated with what was happening this morning. And when I look at our theme, which says about our common future, I was fascinated by the demography of everyone who was sharing since this morning, both from an age perspective and from an ethnicity perspective. And because I am so much into young people, I was just hoping that as the program goes, hopefully we can have some young blood coming on stage to share what's happening. So at Teach for All, growing up in Zimbabwe, I grew up in a community where access to quality education was a privilege to those people that had funding. I remember one speaker in the morning talking about how they sent their children to private schools. But for someone like me, most people around me, my siblings, my sisters, got pregnant by the time they were 13 because we had nothing to aspire. But fast forward, I think for me, I was just fortunate that it happened that some people doing similar work like what Teach for All did came into our neighborhood, and that's how my life changed. I went into this trajectory where at this point in my life, I'm able to influence not just in Zimbabwe, not just in Africa, but globally. So I saw the value in education. So a lot of our speakers talked about corruption, they talked about, enterprising, they talked about health and other things. I think for me, as far as if we don't invest in education for young people, those things could only become accessible to the privileged ones. At Teach for All, what we do is, most organizations, I remember when I was growing up, I really wanted to work for the big law firms. I wanted to work for like the big four, like the PWCs and things like that. No one had actually come to me and said, you know what, Vongai, if you become a teacher or if you work in the teaching field, you could actually be changing your life. I remember my father used to tell me off if I wasn't working hard and said, if you're not serious, you end up becoming a teacher. So I grew up with this perception that anyone who went into the teaching field wasn't as bright. You either had to become a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer. But when I look back into my life, around everything that has defined who I am, I almost refer back to teachers. So at Teach for All, what we do is we look for the best and the brightest in different communities. So Teach for All is a network of 49 independent, locally led organizations in different countries across the world. And we go to universities, we work with people who've graduated, and then once we've identified the best and the brightest, each of our country teams work to put them in high need areas. I think in UK most of you know about Teach First because that's a similar thing. Teach First UK, there's Teach for America, but we've got different Teach for organizations in Africa as well, and we're expanding at a pace. So once we've identified the best and the brightest, the cream of the cream, they spend 2 years of their life, high need communities, and then beyond the 2 years, most of them, they become champions of education. We strongly believe that it's one thing to say to someone, we need to influence policy, we need to influence that. unless people have got a first-hand interaction or first-hand experience of what happens in those communities that most teachers, even in Africa, do not want to go into, it's so life-transforming. We have seen that once, what we call them fellows when they're doing the 2 years, and then once our fellows finish, they become what we call alumni. And so far, most of our alums have gone into different fields. About 70% or so have stayed within the education space. Some of them have started NGOs which address educational issues. Some of them have gone into policy. Some of them have gone into health. And some of them have gone into like setting up different organizations. So what we strongly believe in, I think a number of people here said, we need leaders to change their mindsets. We need leaders to do, there was a whole list. But we strongly believe that for us, the leaders that we are growing within the Teach for All World and other organizations that do similar work are going to be the champions. They are going to, because one of the things that we emphasize is around ethical leadership. And if I give an example, I was in Uganda recently where we are doing some work in this particular community where for like 2 years there were no teachers because the government wasn't paying some of the teachers. We did put in some of our fellows in that school. 20% of the, there were only 30% of the kids attending school because some of them were hungry, there wasn't any food in the home. So rather than our fellows just focusing on the academic attainment of the kids, they went into the villages, they spoke to the elders, they spoke to the different families, and then they encouraged the community to pull together resources. So for example, each family who could afford was encouraged to put in either 5 kgs of rice and 5 kgs of beans. They started doing a school feeding program at the school, and right now the education, the school attendance has improved to 80%, and the academic attainment over the last, we've been checking 3 years, have actually improved. So one of the things we strongly believe for a Teach for All is that it's not just about, it's great to focus on the education attainment, but some of those 21st century skills that we're being talked about today, education, innovation, how can we weave them in what we do on a day-to-day basis? We look at the social aspect of the child, we look at the whole child itself. And what we come from an angle, what we call collective leadership, which most people here talk about. And what we mean when we talk about collective leadership, it influences how we interact our work. For example, some of our fellows who finished the program, they've started an enterprise. I think one of them is called, I just need to get the name right. We believe in working together to ensure a child is the support they need. So for example, one of our alum called Quim Sabria co-founded and leads an Edge Puzzle, a tech platform that allows teachers to create engaging video content and track student progress. And at the moment, this has become one of the biggest video content, it's the largest crowdsourced video lesson platform, and it's used by over 1 million people. And then we also strongly believe that it's one thing, like today there were so many conversations, but I was really hoping that we would have a voice of a young person, like even much younger than most of us here. So one of the things we advocated Teach for All is how do we construct the future in the reality with the people that are affected by that, the inequalities we are talking about, and then B, the people that have got the power to make things happen. So for example, one of our fellows again in Uganda called Charles Obore, he was one of 10, and he was again on this trajectory of not going to university and not having access to anything. And then through sheer access to education and some of the support they got from teachers who are dedicated, now he ended up going to the largest university in Uganda, coming up with a first-class degree, and he wanted to go to Harvard, he wanted to go to law school, he was headhunted by PwC and other people, but this guy has given 2 years of his life to work in one of the most rural places, where even if you want to get a signal, you have to climb on top of the tree. And these are the real leaders and champions of Africa, so it's something that we are proud of. And then the last thing that when we talk about collective leadership, it's about how do you ensure you hear the voices of everyone in the room. Before coming to Teach for All, I was a consultant doing a lot of work with the UN and other big bodies. I remember we used to make lots of policy changes, and when you ask yourself, whose voice are we listening to in the room, would realize that most of us sitting on the table are coming from a position of privilege. We make so many assumptions, and we are looking from our world view, and sometimes we almost pity party like we are doing this to them. And it doesn't work, really. So one of the things we strongly believe in is that how do we ensure the voice of the child is not only the child. So for example, in most of our programs, and I'll pick about what we call Teach for Haiti, or APA, what we do in the area is, Najin, who's our CEO and founder, she pulled together like grandmothers, grandfathers, community leaders, teachers, educationists, different wide range of people, and started asking them what was the aspiration they wanted for each child. And as some of you are aware, historical challenges in Haiti, there were lots of people who were raped. There were so many things that happened which were not addressed. And one of the things that she advocated for is how do we address some of the social injustices that we might perpetuate right now in the name of wanting to help. And these are some of the things that we do.
Can you hear me? No? This better? Yeah, much better. Hello everyone, so my name is Angela Maruli. I work within the Africa program at the Foundation for Women's Health and Research Development. We are an African diaspora-led organisation based in Willesden Junction, worked in the UK since the 80s, mainly pioneering work on female genital mutilation, other issues of sexual and gender-based violence, obstetric fistula, and child marriage, just to name a few. But we have programs on the continent as well, so working in East Africa, Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, Sierra Leone, Nigeria, and Ghana, again, just to name a few. But just to echo a lot of what was discussed earlier on, I really loved what some of my colleagues brought up, the need for multi-stakeholders to work together, the need for young people's voices to be at the forefront of the change that we want to see, and also, just the need for diversity within policy and decision making. But before I get into the work we do, because we do a lot of work mainly on sexual and gender-based violence and women's rights, I just want to, just to share with you some figures regarding the fact, for example, that 200 million women have experienced female genital mutilation. 4 out of 10 women within Central, well, I wouldn't even say women, girls in Central and West Africa have been subjected to child marriage. And we know that a third of all women globally will have experienced some form of sexual and gender-based violence from a male non-partner or intimate partner, and that does not include same-sex women in same-sex relationships. And these are not just issues that are out there, they're issues that are on the continent as well. But I'd like to just present just 3 small concerted movements that we believe, working as a non-profit organisation, are effective in working against violence that women and girls experience, because sometimes it can feel like something so overwhelming. And I think the first one would be using the rally cry, so things like Me Too, things like One Ask campaign, which has been prominent in Uganda, things like Women's March London, Women's March Nairobi. All of these are important, so women and girls, or women and men actually, showing up, using their voices to speak truth to power. For instance, I can just recall in the last 2 years, a lot of video footage has come about of lecturers sexually harassing their students. 5 years ago, I doubt that Makerere University in Uganda would have dealt with sufficiently or appropriately a complaint of sexual harassment, let alone tweet the suspension letter of one of their lecturers, which they recently did. And here we are, living in the ripple effects of a rally cry. And I suppose that is one small movement that we can all collectively use to impact our common future, particularly when it comes to women and youth, because they are implicated all across issues of health, infrastructure, etc. And the second movement I'd like to present to you as well is the local feminist network. So my colleague has already raised the importance of nurturing leaders. Again, one of our colleagues earlier on brought up the issue of Africans are not beggars, and they should be treated with dignity. I mean, it's a no-brainer. But ensuring that the young women we work with are at the forefront of choosing the solutions for the change that they want to see. They don't need sympathy, they don't need handouts either. Me, myself, being a young woman who has benefited from a Ford program, which allowed me to put on my own program at university, speaking on FGM. But again, similar to you actually, we have a leadership program. And I just think about one of our Tuanzeshe fellows in Uganda who was able to identify a need for political representation when it comes to sexual harassment. And the opportunity to actually address policymakers is relatively unheard of regarding sexual and gender-based violence. But the fact that they were able to identify that solution and to be at the forefront of that, these are the kind of innovative but simple solutions that we should be looking towards. And I guess the final thought I'd leave you with as well is not to negate the importance of investing in the individual woman holistically as well. It's all well and good setting up or enrolling X amount of girls into comprehensive sexual education programs, or, for example, setting up gender desks in various districts. Yes, that does have an impact, and yes, it's a step towards ending violence against women and girls, but it's important as well that we are thinking about the individual woman. Is she going to have to pay fare to get to the centre? Is she going to have to ask for fare, distance to the centre? So yeah, I just hope that I've left you with some small nuggets of thoughts for how we can practically impact our common future.
Thank you so much for that, and it's certainly inspiring to hear what Makerere University did, obviously one of the most prestigious, influential universities in Africa. We'll now hear from Nichimunya Hamukoma, who just flew in today from South Africa, and it's such a pleasure to have her with us here. Thank you.
Okay. Can you okay. Cool. Well, thank you so much for having me today. It's such a pleasure to be able to speak to you. And one of the things I'm so glad that you read before me, because I was starting to get a bit nervous. I was like, oh darn, I don't think it's investment enough. But I'm so happy that when we think about investing in a common future, it's such a broad range of things that we're talking about, and it's such there's such an amazing collection of thoughts and skills that we need to bring together a common future. So I'm really grateful to be speaking with you today. And I'm also glad that the panel looks like this. I don't normally get to speak on panels that look like this. So what I'm going to be talking today is about the space aspect and about infrastructure. I lead a project called The Future of African Cities, where for the last 2 to 3 years we've been traveling around the continent to try and understand what are the basic building blocks that you need for African cities to thrive in the future. And the reason that it's so important for us to do this is because by 2050, 1.7 billion Africans will be living in cities. In just a little bit over 30 years, Africa will become an urban continent. And that means that our fundamental imagination of what the continent needs and what the continent looks like will have to change in that time period. On top of that, it's not only an African issue, urbanization, it's also a global issue, because over about 85% of the world's next wave of urbanization will be happening in Africa. So it creates such an interesting and dynamic inflection point for us to do something about that, and to harness that kind of change in a way that's productive and exciting. Like it was said earlier about the 22nd century, which is something I haven't even thought about yet really, that it's either going to be locked or unlocked through Africa. And I think it's really important to start thinking now about the things that we do. And so also, when we think about future things, people normally have like really sexy images in their mind, like robots, smart grids, like really cool, super futuristic issues. But what we found over the last 3 years of research is that what most African cities really need are the basics. So it's the unsexy stuff. It's waste management, it's sanitation, it's roads, and it's housing. But what's really, really cool about those unsexy things is that they create a really cool space for pragmatic innovation. And that's kind of where I think we can really have like exciting and dynamic growth on the continent, where we bring in pragmatism. So it's putting in kind of policies that will actually solve the problems that people have. It's putting in the kind of financial structures that make sure that the money goes where it's supposed to and can actually get invested properly. And then it's the innovation aspect of thinking about what's the best way that we could possibly solve these issues. One of the cities that we've been researching is Lagos. And I'm not sure how many people in the audience are familiar with Lagos, but it is one of the most amazing dynamic and also incredibly frustrating cities to be in at any given time. At the moment, Lagos has a population that's estimated at somewhere between 17 and 24 million. We were working directly with the governor of the state, and nobody could give us an exact number as to how many people were actually there. That differential of a couple of million is astounding. And if all goes to plan, within the next 50 years or so, Lagos will become the world's third largest city and double its population. So you've got a city that has all of this promise, all of this growth, but also the challenges that we talked of waste management, housing, roads, and transportation at a scale that seems a little bit overwhelming and impossible to deal with. And that's where the pragmatic innovation can come through. As the Braintrust Foundation, one of the things that we proposed was a housing solution for Lagos. The city's had a lot of problems with forced removals and housing solutions that have kicked people off their land and replaced them with other, oftentimes wealthier people in the same areas. And this creates a really strong problem in Lagos because right now their housing deficit is between 2 to 5 million. Approximately 70% of the city lives in slum-like conditions, and 86 new residents are added to Lagos every hour. What can a city do to solve that? How do you fix the challenge of that? First thing is that the state as it stands doesn't have those resources, which is a good thing to know because oftentimes we look to the government to provide solutions to these kinds of programs. And in that sort of tricky space of how do we fix such a big challenge is where the Braintrust Foundation's housing solution came in. So we brought in a world famous architect, Sarah Calvin, to try to think, how do we design an in-situ upgrade project that would allow people to stay on their land and that would also allow us to harness the talent and skill of housing that's already happening in Lagos, because most of the houses in Lagos at the moment are self-built. And so with the architect, with members of the government, with local NGOs, the solution that we propose would be an in-situ housing where government or an aid agency would come in and help to supply the frame for housing. So you put in pile-ups, so big, deep piles within the current roads that already stand in informal settlement areas. You then provide concrete slabs over them and add additional piles. So what you have then is the structural integrity of the building is in place already without having to move the people away underneath it. Then, in order to keep the cost down and to build skill and to harness the community's talents already, you'd allow or create a program that would help the residents to build the walls themselves. So you have the structural integrity that already exists, and then you allow the residents and teach residents how to use maybe technologies like sandbags or clay to infill the walls and to create their homes for themselves. And hopefully, in that way, you'll be able to keep costs down and to create more safe and healthy living environments for different people. The project is still in its ideation phase. It's been proposed and we're still in a pilot phase trying to think of ways in which this can actually be implemented. But I think it's something that speaks to this idea of pragmatic innovation, where we're honest with the problems that we have to solve and we think about what's the best possible way to solve those issues.
Thank you so much.
All right. Yeah. I'm Ejike Udogo. I'm a senior lecturer in economics. Actually, what I'm going to speak to you guys about under three headings is going to be economic complexity. We talk about institutions, and we talk about economic development. Because I think a lot of things being said there is about investing in our future, common future, and you think about it. In Nigeria, for instance, 0 to 25, I think, makes up around 62% of the population currently in Nigeria. So we'll talk about the figures, we'll talk about these ones. Now, currently, Nigeria's export, around 83% of Nigeria's export is based on commodities, oil, and revenue. So when you want to think about economic development, which is reduction of poverty or inequality and all that, you have to think about economic complexity. Now, what I mean by economic complexity is kind of measures the capabilities of the population in a particular country. So in Nigeria, for instance, they kind of goods that export and they produce, I think, manufactured exports, less than 3% or thereabout of the total exports. And that kind of makes the economy sort of not really developed. So we need to harness the capabilities. Now, I think a lot of times we talk about technologies, and there are three things about technologies. You think about the tools itself. When you hear people say technologies, people always think about cell phones or IT companies and all that. So technology, you're thinking about the tools itself. You have what we call codified knowledge, and then you have the tacit knowledge. You need these three things in order to have a complex economy that we need to continue development. Now, I think the problem with poor countries, we've done research, the problem is they don't have that tacit knowledge. Now, these three things I mentioned about technology, two of them are tradable. The tools you can get from FDI, the codified knowledge you can pass from one person to the other, or the tacit one, which is the brain's ability to process information and to do things. You need the individuals. So poor countries, you notice, don't have the capabilities. So, and now you think of how do we improve this capability? And I think the previous speakers, they touched on several aspects of this. Education is one of it. So if you have proper education, you'll be able to develop the population. And also if you connect, it's not about having individual capability, but collective capability. So you need the individuals to be connected in order for them to develop an economy. Now, the problem with Nigeria, for instance, I did a study on Nigeria recently, it's lack of government, not government per se, but lack of investment in education. Now, if you look at, when I do comparison studies, and I look at other developed countries, and I just realize, problem with poor regions is they don't invest in research and development. There's not enough funding going to research and development. There's not enough training of retaining these talents in that country. And so you have to train the talents, you have to retain them. And also, so if you don't have institutions that will encourage this, then you have problems with economic development. And I think that's why some African countries are really struggling. And I recently was just looking at, so what are we doing actually for the future generation? It's quite, earlier on some speakers were talking about corruption, for instance. We've had oil for the past how many years in Nigeria, for instance, and it's only 2011 that they actually established the savings fund, the sovereign wealth fund. Now, it only came operational in 2013. Currently, the sovereign wealth fund for Nigeria is only 2 billion. Now, compare that to Norway's highest sovereign wealth fund, which is around $1 trillion US. And you talk about Abu Dhabi, like 800 and all that. Even in sub-Saharan Africa, Nigeria's sovereign wealth fund is not even the largest. I think it's the third largest sovereign wealth fund. So enough needs to be done with regards to the institution. So the three things I said, the economic complexity is a requirement. Technology is needed for that. And the technology, you've got three types of technology. Two, the codified knowledge and the tacit knowledge. The institutions to ensure that the capabilities are established are not really not there at the moment. We talked about corruption with regards to rule of law. So you have financial institutions not well developed. We talk about education system, not really well established, and other different institutions. So these are things that we need to tackle if we are to have any sustainable, meaningful development in the future. Currently, we are talking about Industry 4.0. Now, if we're not careful, I mean, our future generation, I'm afraid, might actually suffer because, according to the BP statistical yearbook, I think Nigeria's oil reserve has until 43 years from now to run out. If we continue producing 2.3 million barrels per day. So if we don't tap into the Industry 4.0, which has to do with automation and driverless cars and robots and all this, if we don't have the capabilities, tap into that the industry, I think Africa as a whole will still struggle and lag behind in the near future. So that's just what my take on this whole thing. So enough has to be done with regards to this station.
Thank you so much. We'll now hear from the last speaker of the panel.
Is this better? Yes. Okay. I think you may have got a gist of what I already said, so I won't repeat it in the interest of time. So young people worldwide, as we know, are both more in number and also more mobile. The largest young generation in history currently comprises some 1.8 billion members, and of the world's around 268 million international migrants. 11% in 2017 were between the age of 15 and 24. And as we have heard since the morning quite a number of times, that Africa has the most youthful population in the world and is even projected to increase to 42% by 2030 and count for 2.4 billion young people by 2050. So that's one aspect. But when you talk about migration, intra-African migration accounts for over 80% of all African migration. So there's a lot of people on the move, and in the context of Africa as well. But 80% of that are within Africa. And like most would think, especially from the 2015 phenomena and onwards, it's not that everybody has packed their bags and are knocking on Europe's door. Most of it is within Africa. Bearing that in mind, and to understand the drivers of migration in Africa, it is also important to recognize the close links between demographic factors, expansion of tertiary education, youth unemployment, and skilled emigration. The size of African youth cohorts is now more than 20% of the population, higher than any part of the world, and will continue to grow. And on current trends, Africa has the fastest growing working age population, as we have already heard before. It will grow more than 4 times and will continue to increase over the next 40 years. However, although they constitute about 35% of Africans' working age population, unfortunately, 3/5 of this total is unemployed. So what do we do? From our perspective in this context, and there could be various solutions, of course, but one part also could be that when it is an inevitable phenomena that there will be people on the move because of these circumstances. And therefore, how do we see such people on the move to be an important driver for development and empowerment? When we talk about migration, it needs to be an integral part of the wider efforts to create jobs and improve educational opportunities for young people, which can bring choice to their lives rather than a route of escape. So we in IOM believe that we need to bring conducive environment where migration is a choice that is being made and not that people have to go as a last resort or to save their lives. The world is transforming at an accelerated rate. Labor markets are shifting with the impacts of new technologies and demands. Communities are managing rapid population turnover and external shocks, such as from conflict, instability, natural disaster, or even slow onset of climate change are even more frequent. Education is at the heart of not only the Sustainable Development Goals, but also the recently adopted Global Compact for Migration. And I just wanted to use this forum to actually talk about those multilateral frameworks, and also coming from the UN background, about what is happening regarding some of the ambition that is around youth. Knowing that we are talking about a youthful Africa. Because we have to understand that all that is happening in the multilateral world, what the international community is involved, we don't have to look at that is maybe a 50,000 feet view of what is happening out there. Unless people in the or communities and entities at the grassroots level are engaged with those initiatives, you will not see the impact that it bears to have. And therefore, for example, we are committed to developing specific activities targeting the youth and addressing their needs and vulnerabilities. More recently, IOM has developed an action plan aligned with the UN Youth Strategy and Agenda 2030, in which initiatives, programs, and activities are proposed for young people on the move. Such initiatives focus on gathering knowledge and expertise on youth and facilitating evidence-based global awareness. Just one more aspect about migration and being a development and having a development role is also around remittances. As we know, remittances continue to climb globally upwards, while remittance sending costs remain relatively high. The sum of financial remittances sent by international migrants back to their families in origin countries amounted to an estimated 601 billion in 2015, and it far, far exceeds overseas development aid. How can we make remittances contribute to development even more actively than what it is today? Because as we know that when it far exceeds development aid, it can actually have even more potential than what aid can foresee to do. Evidence also shows that skilled migration helps increase foreign investment in migrants' countries of origin and creates trade networks between origin and destination countries. And from this aspect, we are talking to various entities, governmental and non-governmental, and also diaspora-led organizations, to see how diasporas can support this. You have heard about diaspora investment, but also there can be knowledge and skills transfer and so on. We are doing a small project, for example, with Sierra Leone government to actually have health professionals here support and do a knowledge exchange back in Sierra Leone. And the last 12 months have seen about 80 diaspora individuals impact more than 20,000 individual needs for healthcare back in Sierra Leone. They've also developed e-tutorials for the universities in healthcare there and are contributing through technology towards capacity building of health professionals. And this came also in the back of the Ebola crisis and so on and situation. So now we are also working around having diasporas play a bigger role in the humanitarian responses when emergencies take place. And why this is important? Because, as you know, after the emergencies, you then have the recovery phase and the long-term rehabilitation. And that is where we are then start talking about development. And if the diasporas are actually able to contribute to their countries of origin, because we can make it a win-win. It is not only they are contributing to their countries of destination, but they can continue to contribute to their countries of origin. And this we see can have also a very long-term impact. And regarding young people's voices, I think if the policies of Commonwealth countries are to be fit for not just today, but for tomorrow, all the voices of these young people must be shared in their formulation. Giving young people a stake and a say is at the very heart of investing in our common future. We have Of course, the multilateral frameworks like the Sustainable Development Goals, but also, for example, with IOM, we have the Global Compact of Migration, where heads of states for the first time have signed up to such a compact. And therefore, I would just like to probably conclude by saying or reiterating or sort of stating the 5 distinctive aims of the United Nations Youth Strategy. It is to amplify youth voices for the promotion of a peaceful, just and sustainable world. It is to support young people's greater access to quality education and health services, support young people's greater access to decent work and productive employment, protect and promote the rights of young people and support their civic and political engagement. And support young people as catalysts for peace and security and support the civic and political engagement. So I think just wanting to summarize that all these are the stated objectives coming from the Secretary General himself of the United Nations. And it is for us to engage in this process at a even starting from the grassroots level to make it more impactful. Thank you for listening.
Well, that's bizarre that the microphone cut off there at exactly 5 o'clock. But let's still take some time for a couple questions from some of the, we've heard from all the speakers. So we will now have a couple questions from the floor. Yes? Well, let's, is there another question on the floor? We can take 3 questions. Okay, we can just answer that, yeah.
No, I think where I came from was not about more migration, but when migration happens, it should be managed so that it works for the benefit of all. And what we see and the narrative around, especially, of course, today is a very politically sensitive, as you can see, not only here, but in many of the, let's say, countries, if putting simplistically, of the global north, it can become very challenging. So it's not about more numbers, but it is for making it work, because it is an inevitable phenomena. You know, people migrate, and that is perfectly normal. But how do you make that work for all the countries involved? And that is from where I came from. Point number 1. And I think the second point also I wanted to say that yes, brain drain can be a challenge, but then you can also have brain gain, because you see a lot of people also contributing back and going, and that's where I mentioned about the Sierra Leone project, where people who have skills here and gained here are wanting to contribute. So it's to facilitate those channels. You know, we have to understand this is also a catalyst or an actor that can play a huge role to, for the development of their countries of origin.
My concern is more about the migrants who risk their lives at sea.
Yes.
Somebody who managed to get a visa and go and do the rest of the but those risking their lives.
Yes, and you are perfectly right, sir. And I think that is where we have to look at the causes and the drivers for irregular migration. And that's why where we said migration should be a choice made by people and not by, because they are required out of necessity. And how do you create that environment? And secondly, I think, the drivers we keep saying, yes, that is sort of the push side, let's say the supply side. But there is a demand here. But are there enough regular channels for these people to access? And that is why people then go to the sea and risk their lives. They shouldn't be coming here, but in that way. But there should be probably more mobility pathways and regular pathways that they can access to. Unfortunately, that is not the case. And we at IOM, or also with a lot of many other stakeholders, are trying to see how those pathways can be broadened so that you reduce the risk of this irregular migration.
All right, we have the microphone is alive again. If there's any other questions, yes.
Hi, my question, sorry, I've forgotten your name. Angela, my name is Kadi, I'm a medical professional as well. I was really curious, you mentioned about fighting about FGM and putting the word out there. I'm actually also against that. I'm actually a victim, actually. Recently, there was an outcry where our First Lady in Sierra Leone went online and spoke about, was interviewed, technically. It's a very sensitive topic. Some of us have gone through God knows what. And I've recently been in June in Sierra Leone, delivered a 19-year-old, almost lost her life due to secondary effects from FGM. Her statement, her argument was there's not enough research to support that there's actually adversities happening in women's lives. So you being out there, how best are you guys keeping these data to be able to use them in the future? If someone was to, let's say, stand up against you to say, actually there's not enough research to show. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's a really good question. It's really important as well when we do research that we're not just taking a lot of what in the West, for example, any medical research done here and then taking it back to any practicing communities and trying to enforce it, because then that's when we get issues of cultural insensitivity, a lot of people not understanding why practices take place. So a lot of the work we've done is mainly on peer research, so working with survivors, getting them to go into their communities, asking girls who may be at risk or who have already experienced FGM to conduct these interviews with their communities, and then using their voices to advocate for change. Also introducing, getting again our champions, even in the UK where practicing communities live, using their voices to advocate for change. So it always comes down to the survivors and making sure that everything we do is about them. So a lot of our, just to answer your question, a lot of our work has come through peer research. We find that peer research to be critical. But yeah, I'm very interested to speak with you on this as well. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Just on the FGM question, we run a very large social network with 7.5 million people, 100,000 of them in Sierra Leone, who read us regularly. Now, we work on FGM as well, and the interesting thing was we have 200 authors who write creatively on FGM, and we don't give an opinion, we just give reflection. Now, the reflection on that it hurts girls made no impact on Africa. Nobody responded really. Then we had reflections on how birth was changed, and very little reflection on that as well. Then we kind of wrote about how that changes sex life, and very complicated. Very little response on that too. But finally we wrote about how we all believe in God and the higher beings, and how we don't think why should we correct what God has done and created himself. And I can tell you it closed down our network. It was, the whole continent was hopping, and it was hopping mad. And the discussion groups were so busy that we simply couldn't cope with it. And I think all these attitudes on loads of subjects, it's about finding the right angle. And I think we need to test run it, and social media is the way forward.
Oh, 100%. I think it definitely comes down to context, because in a lot of places, you can, say for example in Kenya, so where I'm from, and there's practicing communities in Kenya, we have introduced other rites of passage. So for example, instead of having cutting, introducing like a certificate to show that the girl is now a woman, and that has been effective. But if you go to other contexts, we can say, okay, why don't we find that it's more of an economic thing, and actually the cutters are not willing to get rid of it because this is how they get income. So we now look at other income generating activities. But also in some contexts, I think we're working on it, but you just find that it's so culturally embedded, and like you say, it comes down to the occult or even to God. And some people are saying, actually, no, we can't get rid of this because this is intrinsic to who we are. So I just, to echo what you said, definitely depends on the context. Yeah, very interesting.
Do we have another question from the audience? Okay, well with that then I think we should give our final panel of the day a warm round of applause.